Alright, hello everyone. We are finally in for the second video this month. I was unfortunately not able to get to a video last week due to unforeseen circumstances that come about, but we are finally getting to that this week. So for this week's video, I wanted to hit kind of another local topic, at least where I live it is, and to our northern neighbor of Michigan. It is a local topic that really is kind of obscure today, but it's also kind of shocking that it ever took place, and that is the whole matter of what we now call the Toledo War, which, despite its name, was not really a war, more of a simply a border dispute gone bad, that fortunately no one ended up dying, but it did almost come to that point in many circumstances. And what the Toledo War was essentially a boundary dispute over who was going to inherit the area of land called the Toledo Strip, which included the area of land around what is now Toledo, Ohio. And we will kind of go through how this whole border dispute even gets set up, where the justification for this dispute comes from, and how it eventually got sort of resolved. I don't really call it resolved. I kind of call it forced, because Michigan was very much forced to give up its side of the argument by Congress and by the federal government. So we will go through that today because that is a topic that I don't think is given a lot of attention, and I myself, until about roughly 9 years ago, didn't even know about this had even existed as a historical event. So, for the Toledo War, we got to trace its origins all the way to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that ended up creating the Northwest Territory that had been passed that year. The Northwest Ordinance, mind you, the Northwest Territory is the first official territory to be set up by the United States after the American War of Independence. It also is significant because in this ordinance, it sets up the Northwest Territory, established laws, schools, and governorship for the territory, most notably townships, and it also abolished slavery within the territory. There would be no slave states that were created out of this territory. Slavery would not be legal in any of the states to come out of it. Eventually, the Northwest Territory would comprise couple new states. Article 5 of the Northwest Ordinance set up how the land was to be divided into new states, and it is quite extensive how it actually sets them up to be divided. But long story short, the 5 states would later be created from all, if not part, of the Northwest Territory. I say part because one state kind of just had a little sliver, and that would have been Minnesota. Minnesota had a sliver. The other states that were completely created within the boundaries of the Northwest Territory were Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, along with that little sliver of Minnesota as well. However, Article 5 of the Northwest Ordinance also included a phrase that would cause quite a bit of trouble as the years went on, and at the time, I'm sure it wasn't really thought of. And this particular phrase stated that the southern bend of Lake Michigan would form the boundary of at least 2 states to the north of that border. So, what the ordinance says is the southern bend of Lake Michigan, that's going to act as like the southern extent of 2 northern states that are going to start from there and go north. And at the time, nobody really thought that was going to be an issue. It sounded like a good issue on paper. You wouldn't think that a massive dispute would come out of that until you realize just how bad maps were back then, and then you're going to get to a whole nother scenario. In 1802, so let's fast forward a couple years here. In 1802, Congress would pass the Enabling Act that laid the foundation for my home state of Ohio to end up being admitted as a state. Ohio was ready for statehood. It had attained the required number of citizen population needs that it needed to do. It had set up its own government to take the thing of becoming a state. It set up its own state constitution for it to have a constitution to run a new state government when it would be admitted. That was our first constitution, was in 1802. And the Enabling Act passed by Congress is laying the foundation. Okay, Ohio's ready. Let's get it on the ball. Let's get it on the ball here and get it admitted. Unfortunately, we will never see that today in terms of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is more than ready, as indicated as such, but because Congress likes to play political games, that same speedy process will never happen now. But back then, it was no problem because people didn't want to play games. So in 1802, when the Enabling Act passed, it uses the southern limit of Lake Michigan with a line to Lake Erie as Ohio's supposed northwestern border. That this line to Lake Michigan to Lake Erie is going to form the border. Now, here's the problem. This is in line with the Northwest Ordinance, But Congress is envisioning that it's simply a straight line. Given the maps that they have, they think that it's a simply straight line. There's no curves, there's no deviation north or south with it. It's a straight line from the very southern bend of Lake Michigan over here to Lake Erie. It's a straight line. No problem. They're wrong, though, because back then, as we know, maps are not entirely as accurate as they are now. They're not as fine-tuned. We don't have satellite imaging. Surveying is still rudimentary in some terms. There can be a little bit off when you're measuring distances or measuring, a straight line from one point of land to another. And this is what ends up happening because although Congress has stated that they want this northwestern border for Ohio to run in a straight line from the southern bend of Lake Michigan to Lake Erie, and somewhere along that line is going to be its northwestern border, because we already have the western border with what it will become Indiana set up. The problem comes that it's not a straight line. Lake Michigan actually comes down a bit further south than the western end of Lake Erie does, that very southern bend. So actually the line should have been a little lower. Not by much, maybe by about 10 miles or so, but it was enough that it was a problem. And this problem was going to end up becoming an irate issue as it went on. It was a good strip of land. It was more wide than it was long. But this would become a major problem because what Congress is saying is, okay, we want it from Lake Michigan to Lake Erie, but the line that you're proposing isn't exactly along what it should be, according to that wording. And that is going to cause major issues going forward. So we've specified here what the main issue ends up coming, and also did not specify where the proposed line was supposed to meet Lake Erie at. Was it supposed to meet at the very western edge of the lake? Was it supposed to go more to the southwest? They didn't specify that. On March 1st of 1803, Ohio would be admitted to statehood as the nation's 17th state. The state's 1802 Constitution actually claimed the boundary line that was proposed in the Enabling Act, given that the Enabling Act was the only legal basis at that time, and there was no other really any challenges to it at the time. Ohio had no problem with that, and thus felt more than ready. Okay, Congress said this is our border, we're taking this as our border. Just north of the port, the line would go just north of the port of Vistula, which would become Toledo, Ohio. It would later change its names, of course, which was at the mouth of the Maumee River. And no one knew at the time, but Vistula, or Toledo, as it will later be called, is going to become the biggest port on western Lake Erie. And it's going to be the main gem that both of these states want. So at the time, in 1803, it is accepted that that area of land belongs to Ohio. Congress has specified it. They don't quite realize there's been an error yet, and they just take it as fact. On January 11th of 1805, the Territory of Michigan ended up being created just about 2 years down the road. When laying out their southern border, however, the territorial government of Michigan disagreed on where it should be according to the Northwest Ordinance, which is what they're using as their guidebook. Because according to the territorial government of Michigan, the southern border of the territory should actually be slightly southwest of where Ohio said that it was. And this is where the debate's going to start as early as 1805. So not even a full 20 years after the Northwest Ordinance is passed, we're starting to already have a debate between one party that took Congress's word and another party that now realizes, well, Congress was wrong. Because according to the wording passed in the ordinance, you're off by a couple miles. In 1812, after lobbying for several years, the Michigan Territory called for a survey to determine the northern border of Ohio with the southern border of Michigan, to determine it once and for all and to settle this dispute. Unfortunately, that wasn't exactly the right time to request it, because very shortly after, as we all know, 1812 in June, the War of 1812 breaks out with Great Britain, and the United States is engaged in a 2-year-long conflict where it's fighting for its own survival, because let's be honest here, we might have declared war on Great Britain, but we should not have, because they very easily could have wiped us off, because this is the same time they're fighting Napoleon. And as soon as they were done kicking Napoleon's rear, they had no problem coming over here and start kicking ours. They burned our capital. We were lucky to survive that war. But the War of 1812 would end up delaying the survey by 5 years, until 1817. So in 1817, surveyor William Harris found that the border was in line with Ohio's claim. He went, did his survey. He determined, nope, Michigan, you're in the wrong. What Congress said and what Ohio has said in its 1802 Constitution is in line with what I have found in my surveying. The Ohio legislature would very quickly ratify Harris's borderline in January of 1818. They wanted absolutely no contest. In their minds, Harris just vindicated us. He just said what we wanted to hear, that our border is already correct and Michigan is making a falsehood. This is not true. So in January of 1818, Ohio already quickly ratified the Harris borderline. However, Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass was not satisfied by the Harris survey. In 1819, the federal government would intervene, partially because Cass had then requested another survey at the bequest of President Monroe to be done in order to take another look at the matter. And it was President Monroe who then had another survey appointed in 1819 in order to actually do this again and make sure that Harris was correct. He appointed surveyor John Fulton, and Fulton ended up being a bit more controversial for Ohio because Fulton determined that the borderline was 10 miles south of Toledo, right where Michigan said it should be. So Fulton has a completely different opinion than what Harris had done. Ohio refused to accept the new borderline that Fulton said was now adequate, claiming that Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass had somehow corrupted Fulton into drawing the line and refused to comply with it in any terms. With Illinois having been admitted the year prior, Congress granted Michigan Territory the eastern portion of the Upper Peninsula in the hope of settling the dispute. So, although Fulton has determined that Harris's line was an error and that Michigan is technically correct according to the Northwest Ordinance, Congress refuses to actually act on Fulton's findings and instead offers Michigan the eastern part of the Upper Peninsula that it has now as compensation of some sorts, hoping that that will be enough to maybe get Michigan to back off this claim. Just drop the matter. Ohio's not going to budge. Ohio's already a state. You're not. So they also have representation in Congress. They already have special privileges already just for being a member of the Union, and you're still a territory. So they kind of hope that by giving Michigan this extra bit of land, maybe that'll calm them down. Maybe that'll calm these Michiganders down and they won't press the issue anymore. And it worked for a while. Michigan still had gripes, but it did not explode further at that time in 1818. The land that was between the Harris and Fulton surveying lines became known as the Toledo Strip, as this was the land that was in dispute, the land in between those two different sections. Harris line was the one that Ohio accepted as its border, and which makes up the present-day border, and the Fulton line was the one that Michigan said that was technically correct and Fulton had surveyed and come in favor of, that Ohio opposed. Now, the issue remained undecided for another 2 decades, but this also allowed it to slowly fester as the land within the Toledo Strip became highly coveted by both parties. Land within that strip became highly valuable economically and agriculturally. It could support a large, fertile farmland for corn and wheat, which was very prosperous for either state and their economies. Toledo was rapidly, the port of Vistula, now being renamed Toledo, was becoming the fastest and largest growing port in western Lake Erie, which would give it a massive access to the Great Lakes trade, which, to be fair, I think Michigan had enough access. They had access to Lake Huron and Lake Michigan and Lake Superior at this point. Did you really need it to Lake Erie, too? I mean, you had that, too, technically. But, how many ports do you need? And I'm probably saying that because I'm an Ohioan, of course. But Toledo's becoming prosperous. There's economic farmland to be had, and the mouth of the Maumee River and Maumee Bay is already becoming a vital transportation route. Ohio is already building one of its 2 canals. The Miami Canal at that point, up from Cincinnati up to Dayton, has already been built, and it's planning on building it further if it can to Toledo along the Maumee River, where it will eventually merge with another one and become the Miami and Erie. So Ohio is also planning on using land within that disputed territory to build a canal, an artificial waterway to connect the Ohio River and Lake Erie. So they want this land because they can't build through it if they don't own it. So, of course, they're going to claim they own it. By 1828, Michigan had petitioned several times for statehood by 1828, but each time was refused over the fact that its southern border was still in dispute. Congress saying that until you get this dispute solved, we're not moving forward with this. We can't admit you and have a bordering dispute. You've got to have your borders determined before we admit you. So it delays it by quite a few more years. In late 1833, Governor Lewis Cass would begin the statehood process for Michigan again, bringing the border issue to Congress once more. Congress would send 2 surveyors to determine the border between Michigan and Ohio in 1833. The survey concluded that the Fulton line was correct, but Congress maintained the Harris line as official. So again, these 2 surveyors once again back up the line that John Fulton had put back in 1817, 1818, and they back his claim up. But once again, Congress, unwilling to really force the thing here and say, Ohio, you're in the wrong. Instead of doing that, Congress refused to act on that. Now, why would Congress do this at this point? The reason at that point was partly because Ohio is a state. Ohio has congressional membership and can try to block enforcement of that. And Ohio had allies at that time. 2 other states had joined in opposing Michigan's claim, and that was the neighboring states of Illinois and Indiana. State representatives and senators from both of those 2 states joined with Ohio's congressional delegation in supporting the Harris claim and opposing the one that was back of Fulton's. And the reason that Illinois and Indiana ended up kind of siding with Ohio in this matter was they basically had failed also to follow the Fulton line, as it would affect their borders as well. Indiana would have absolutely no access to the Great Lakes if it actually adhered to the Fulton line, because had it adhered to the Fulton line, it wouldn't have that little sliver that it does along Lake Michigan. So Indiana feared losing its land, and Illinois feared losing territory if it went along the Fulton line to the newly formed Wisconsin Territory. So both Illinois and Indiana, out of the fear of losing land themselves if the Fulton line prerogative was actually enforced, backed Ohio's claim and opposed actually enforcing the Fulton one. They blocked Michigan's attempt to join in 1833, along with Ohio and President Andrew Jackson, who still held up that he wanted the border dispute solved. Since it was still not solved, he blocked it. He went ahead and said, nope, we're still blocking you from joining. Didn't really set well with Michiganders, and it didn't set well with some other members of Congress. One of those was a member of the House, former President John Quincy Adams, who in 1833, when this happened, said the following, and this was his own quote: "Never in the course of my life have I known a controversy of which all the right was so clearly on one side, and all the power so overwhelmingly on the other." And before we go here, we'll show the area that is in dispute. This is the area that is in dispute here. When we say to the Toledo Strip, what we're referring to. So this to the south, the bottom of that strip, up here's Toledo on the Maumee Bay and the Maumee River, Michigan, Ohio. This is the modern day border with Ohio and Michigan, the Harris line. This was the one that was first done back in 1817, that first survey that had ended up being done. Well, not the first survey, but the one that had been done back in 1802, right when Ohio was getting admitted. This was the initial line. This was the one Ohio claimed. This was the one that had been done in 1818, 1817, that John Fulton had done at the request of President Monroe and Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass, and this is where they said the border actually was. This Fulton line, according to the Northwest Ordinance, this was technically the correct border. If that had been held too, Toledo would be part of Michigan today, not Ohio. But Ohio was already a state and thus was able to use its political influence in Congress and the federal government to kind of maintain that, nope, this is the border. We've accepted this for years. Michigan's not even a state yet. Why would you give in to them? And this is the little territory. Anywhere in between these 2 lines, this is the territory that is in dispute. And then here we have a portrait of Territorial Michigan Governor Lewis Cass, who ended up in 1848 years later actually becoming the Democratic Party's nominee for president in the 1848 presidential race. He didn't win, of course. He lost to Zachary Taylor. So in 1834, the citizens of Toledo, recognizing that they had more to gain from kind of connecting with Ohio than they did with the new territory of Michigan, they sent a petition to Ohio Governor Robert Lucas urging the boundary dispute to be resolved and for Toledo to become part of Ohio. Native Toledoans decided our future, our financial stake, our best fortunes are with staying with Ohio instead of going with Michigan. We want to be part of Ohio. That should have also, in my mind, settled the matter, because if the native citizens were saying that they wanted to join Ohio, that was popular sovereignty in its natural essence. The overwhelming majority of the people said they wanted to go one way, it should go that way. Michigan, however, was not about to just let that go. They had a new territorial governor who was only 22 years old. And Andrew Jackson had commonly referred to him with the nickname of the boy governor, and his name was Stevens T. Mason. And Mason tried to negotiate with Lucas regarding the petition that had been sent from Toledo to join Ohio, and he tried to negotiate with Lucas in terms of negotiating. Okay, maybe we can work this out a little bit. I mean, I don't want to go violent over this, and neither did Lucas. Lucas refused to even negotiate on the matter, believing that the dispute was not between Ohio and Michigan, which wasn't even a state yet, but this was a dispute between Ohio and the federal government, since the territory was run by the federal government, essentially. So he refused to even consider negotiating with Mason, arguing that Mason had no true authority in the matter. Lucas would support taking the Toledo Strip and quickly passed legislation claiming it in January of 1835. There were county governments that were created that year by Ohio, with the part of the strip including the city of Toledo becoming part of Lucas County, which would be named in Lucas's honor. Outraged, Mason had Michigan pass the Pains and Penalty Act just 6 days after the setup of counties in the Toledo Strip by Ohio. In this Pains and Penalty Act, it called for all citizens of the Toledo Strip to maintain loyalty to Michigan territory under the threat of, quote, severe penalties. And among these penalties were a $1,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence if you were found supporting Ohio and acting to Ohio's government whims. So this was a blatant attempt by Mason to force the residents of the disputed territory to back Michigan and to try to resist any kind of control or authority from the state of Ohio. Mason would send General Joseph Brown to defend the area and enforce the act against any Ohio actions that would violate the act. With Brown, he sent 1,000 Michigan militia that were directly sent to the city of Toledo. Governor Lucas in Ohio, in response, would also send 1,000 militia to neighboring Perrysburg, just south of Toledo, along with 3 commissioners. Mason hoped that he could use this to his advantage. He knew the commissioners were coming to set up elections for newly elected positions, and he knew that if these elections were actually held, he could then try to arrest them under the Pains and Penalties Act. So he was willing to let the commissioners reach Toledo under the guise that, okay, let's let them reach Toledo. Let's let them do their job, because the moment they do their job, then I'll have the justification for saying that Ohio has violated the act. I didn't violate nothing because I waited until something was actually done, and then I'll have the right here. So he decided to let the Ohio commissioners violate the Pains and Penalties Act first in order to claim that Ohio had started the escalation and not Michigan territory. He was warned by U.S. Secretary of State John Forsyth that President Jackson was watching the situation very, very cautiously, and he was warned by the U.S. Secretary of State that Jackson would get involved if he started to arrest Ohio citizens. Mind you, Jackson is the head of the Democratic Party at this time, of which both Mason and neighboring Governor Lucas are members of, and Mason, despite only being 22 years old, has the guts to basically ignore Jackson's warning, despite Jackson being one of the founders of the party, the head of the party at the time, and a military war veteran from the War of 1812. You did not easily offend Andrew Jackson and get away with it most times. On March 24th of 1835, Jackson sent Benjamin Howard and Richard Rush to act as arbitrators to settle the dispute officially. Jackson was very hesitant at first to use the federal government to intervene in the dispute because he viewed that it would set a bad precedent for every time there was a dispute between states for the federal government to have to resolve it, or for them to lobby the president to get something solved. And he thought that would be a very bad precedent to be set if he went ahead and did that right away. But at the same time, he started to realize that this was getting a bit out of hand, and maybe I ought to do something. So he's considering his options at that point. So he's like, okay, I'm going to send you two. You're going to go be my arbitrators. You're going to go try to bring a peaceful solution to this where the Congress has failed so far, and then report back to me. So Michigan is going to hold an election of township officials for the Toledo Strip, in contrary to Ohio, on April 1st of 1835. And on April 6th, Ohio would hold elections in Toledo when Howard and Rush arrive. Upon hearing the news that Ohio had held elections within the Toledo Strip for townships, on April 8th, just 2 days later, the sheriff from Monroe County, Michigan, to the north, moved into Toledo and began arresting as many as he could with 40 accompanying men. They held mock trials around midnight after arresting quite a few local men that were Ohio supporters, and then sent them to Monroe County Jail. When President Jackson received word from his two arbitrators, Howard and Rush, who were present in Toledo when these arrests were made, they quickly make sure that Jackson is appraised of the situation and kept in constant update. And as soon as Jackson receives word that these arrests have been made, he issues 3 ultimatums to Mason in response to these actions. First, you are to leave the Ohio commissioners alone and allow the continued use of the Harris Line. 2, the people in the Toledo Strip should decide Michigan and Ohio. So Jackson at this point was kind of advocating the popular sovereignty thing. He's advocating let the people in the Strip decide what state they want to be part of. Let them decide. And then 3, cease the enforcement of the Pains and Penalties Act immediately. Of which, again, Mason showing some to put it quite bluntly, showing some great balls for going up against Andrew Jackson, blatantly ignored Jackson's ultimatums and told Jackson, the only way you're going to stop me, remove me. Remove me from my office as territorial governor, which Jackson had the authority to do. He said, I am not going to not enforce these laws and not act in the best goodness of my state if I'm territorial governor. And I am doing exactly what is in the best interest of my soon-to-be state, and I am not going to back down. So the only way this is going to happen is if you remove me. Governor Lucas would send a group of men to remark the northern Ohio border around that same time that these arrests are being made. He had actually sent the men on April 2nd, a day after Michigan had held its own elections within the Strip. These men would reach the northern border on April 25th in an area called Phillips Corners. And while they were there, they were spotted by Michigan militia who then tried to come and arrest them. When the commissioners fled along with their accompanying party, the Michigan militia ended up firing warning shots over their heads in order to try to get them to stop. Mind you, it was not at them, but over their heads enough to say, halt or we will shoot at you. But this was the only time that major shots were fired, thankfully not at people, but over people's heads in order to try to get them to stop. Most of the accompanying party were arrested, except for the 3 commissioners who escaped back to Perrysburg and informed Lucas of what had happened. There were no casualties from the incident. In July, just a couple months later, the Monroe County Sheriff was actually stabbed during an arrest attempt, but he was not gravely injured or ended up dying from the event. He just ended up getting stabbed with a knife. Michigan Territorial tried to have Ohio hand over the man who had done so, but Ohio refused to hand over the man. At this point, Jackson's patience is wearing thin. He's absolutely had enough of Mason defying his orders. Mason has now, his own militia has fired shots. Even though they weren't at troops, they were still close enough that they could have hurt somebody or started a conflict. The border is becoming armed. Residents are getting attacked, are arrested. The sheriff has been stabbed, and Jackson's had enough. Jackson in August would remove Mason from his post in August of 1835. He would appoint a Pennsylvania judge in his place, but he would quickly decide that he didn't really want the position, and the Michigan people, on defiance, reelected Mason to the position as interim governor. Now, the people basically said, we're not backing away from this. Ohio would complete marking the northern border after Mason got reinstated, and Mason at that point did back down a little bit because he realized Jackson was pretty much on Ohio's side at this point, and so was Congress. And Mason would claim that Ohio, upon hearing that Ohio was completing its redetermination of the northern border, he claimed that Ohio could determine it. He was fine if Ohio determined it at this point, but he wanted Toledo to be part of Michigan, of which Lucas said was absolutely unacceptable. The remarcher would be completed in November of 1835, and Congress would now be responsible for handling the dispute in full. Jackson made very clear to Mason that at this point, Michigan was not going to gain statehood, no longer, not just because its southern border was in dispute, but the only way that Michigan would gain statehood at this point was it would have to release all claims that it had on the Toledo Strip. That until they did that, they were not going to have any statehood. Michigan's not getting admitted until you relinquish all your claims on the Toledo Strip. So until you do that, You will remain a territory. So it's pretty much forcing them to. As compensation, however, to try to goad Mason and the Michiganders into accepting giving up their claims to the Toledo Strip, Congress officially offers the rest of the Upper Peninsula, the western part of it, that had been given to Wisconsin. They're offering Michigan, we'll take that away from Wisconsin. We'll give you the entire Upper Peninsula if you relinquish your claims to the Toledo Strip in exchange. This was in early 1836. Mason very reluctantly ended up accepting that offer and accepting that compromise. Jackson would sign the Northern Ohio Boundary Bill on June 15th of 1836, making the exchange official. The Toledo relinquished all claims to the Toledo Strip, and in exchange was given the rest of the Upper Peninsula of what is now Michigan. Which at the time, Michigan didn't really like it. A lot of the residents of Michigan did not like taking that upper territory because they just thought it was a bunch of wilderness. They didn't realize it was vast iron deposits up there yet and a burgeoning timber industry that could really benefit the state and has benefited that state. But at the time, it wasn't really thought of that way. A Michigan delegation would still have to ratify, however, the compromise, and a Michigan delegation had initially failed to ratify it in Ann Arbor in September, but did so finally when reconvening in October. The convention would officially wrap up on December 14th of 1836 at what was called the Frostbitten Convention, and many Michiganders were not exactly happy that they had given up the Toledo Strip in exchange for what they saw as barren land. That would change as the decades went on, but at the time it was still quite raw. Ohio would officially gain the Toledo Strip officially on December 27th of 1836, and Michigan, having fulfilled its end of the bargain that Jackson had struck with them, was officially granted statehood on January 26th of 1837 as the 26th state. After finally accepting that compromise, Jackson dropped all opposition to Michigan becoming a state and said, all right, you've completed your end of the bargain, I will hold true to mine. And Michigan was finally admitted. Here we have a little portrait. This was Stevens T. Mason, the 22-year-old boy governor of Michigan Territory who would become Michigan's first state governor after Michigan became admitted to the Union. He was the one that really escalated this conflict to the point that it almost came to bloodshed because he was just adamant in protecting his own territory, what he saw as Michigan's right. And it was, I think, and essentially, I will admit that as an Ohioan, looking at the facts, Michigan wasn't right. They should have gotten Toledo according to the Northwest Ordinance. I'm not going to blatantly try to whitewash that. And this was Ohio Governor Robert Lucas, a very angry-looking man, very disturbing. But this was Lucas, who was Mason's pretty much opponent in this. So that wraps up not exactly the longest topic, but something that I don't think gets really talked about, the fact that Ohio and Michigan, nowadays, of course, Ohio and Michigan have a massive football rivalry, of course, with Michigan State and Ohio State being massive, Buckeyes and Wolverines against each other, and I understand that. And that's what most people think of. But at one time, Michigan and Ohio did have a rivalry that wasn't just football. It almost went to the point of actual conflict with each other, simply over who would get essentially Toledo of all state cities. And it's quite unknown, I think, to a lot of people that this even ever actually happened. To me, I didn't know about it until almost a decade ago that this had ever even been a thing. So it was actually quite interesting to find out then. And it was very interesting to go back over it now and see some of the more intricacies of it that I think are often forgotten. Now, thankfully, Ohio and Michigan are on much better terms today, other than their sports rivalry. Ironically, in 1915, there was a meeting between the two governors of the two states. They met at that borderline that had been reconfirmed in 1915 and actually shook hands in an official truce to kind of close the whole chapter of that dispute. But they get along, other than their sports rivalry today, they largely get along, nothing like what we had. Thank God. So that wraps up for this video. So for next week, given that we're going into the final 2 weeks here for October, we're either going to do the Halloween video next week or we're going to do it the week after. And then whichever one we don't do will be the William Howard Taft one, which that will be our president for this month. So we'll just see which one we do first, which one might make more sense. I'll have to figure out, but that's the next 2 videos that are coming up. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, any added information that you might have found that I did not, feel free to put that in the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to read through them, especially if it's any added information or anything that maybe I missed. I would definitely like to see that because it is kind of an obscure topic in many ways. So I think that wraps up everything. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their weekend, good rest of their week, a good going into the weekend, and we'll see you all back here for the next video, whichever one that ends up being.